The first sound the people of Pine Hollow ever heard from Clara Winslow was her voice, soft as a hymn and steady as morning light. And that was enough to make them laugh. She'd stepped off the stagecoach with a valise in one hand and a bundle of lesson books in the other. Dust clung to the hem of her traveling skirt, but her posture stayed straight. Her chin lifted as if the prairie wind itself were something she meant to face head-on. The town watched from shaded porches and storefront windows. Outsiders didn't last long here. They came with polished shoes and polite vowels, and the land soon rubbed both away. Inside the general store, she asked for directions to the schoolhouse. "Excuse me, sir," she said to the shopkeeper. Her tone was light, melodic, a voice shaped by libraries, not lariats. He squinted at her. "You the new schoolmarm from back east?" "I am. Clara Winslow." She smiled, hoping manners might soften the moment. Instead, a few ranch hands near the stove chuckled. "She talks like a church bell," one said. "Bell like that won't last a week out here," another replied. Clara's fingers tightened around her gloves, but she only said, "Then let's hope the bell can teach before it breaks." She paid for a tin of lamp oil and stepped back into the glare, leaving their laughter behind her boots. Outside, the air smelled of pine sap and smoke. Far to the west rose the dark shoulders of the mountains. Between here and there stretched miles of gold-grass silence. She stood a long moment on the boardwalk, breathing the vastness until her heart steadied again. Let them laugh, she thought. I came here to speak, not to please. The schoolhouse waited on a low ridge north of town, a one-room frame building with cracked paint and a leaning chimney. When she opened the door, dust floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts. It smelled of cedar, chalk, and rain long past. Somehow she loved it instantly. She set her books on the teacher's desk, rolled up her sleeves, and began to sweep. Each stroke of the broom seemed to erase another piece of the past she'd left behind. The parlor where she'd been told to speak softer. The father who said, "No man wants a wife who corrects his grammar." Here, at least, her words would have purpose. By late afternoon, the room looked almost welcoming. She pinned lace curtains to the single window, then stepped outside to fetch water from the pump. The wind tugged at her bonnet strings. She had just begun to fill the bucket when a quiet voice behind her said, "You'll want to brace that shutter before nightfall. Wind'll tear it clean off." She turned. A man stood by the fence, hat in hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His shirt rolled at the elbows, sun in his hair. There was nothing hurried about him. Even the way he breathed seemed measured. "Caleb Boone," he said when she just looked at him. "Helped raise this place a couple of years back." "Miss Winslow," she replied. "The new teacher." He nodded once. "Welcome, then. Not much here, but what's here lasts." "That sounds like a fine start," she said. His eyes flicked to the loose shutter. "Want a hand?" "I can manage," she began, but the wind slammed it again, making her jump. He caught it easily, one palm flat against the wood. She noticed the careful way he moved, strong but never careless. He nailed the hinge back without a word, then stepped away. "Thank you," she said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." And with that, he was gone, walking down the hill beside his horse, a figure folding into the lengthening shadows. Clara watched until he vanished into the trees. For the first time all day, she felt something besides loneliness. There was steadiness in him, quiet, deliberate, like the pause before a sentence that mattered. That night, she lit her lamp and opened her lesson book. Wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, but the little flame held steady. She wrote the week's lessons in a neat hand. Spelling, numbers, composition. Then, below them, she added one more line no curriculum had required: courage. The strength to keep speaking when the world has stopped listening. When she blew out the lamp, the prairie outside was endless and dark, the kind of dark that could swallow sound. Yet she felt no fear. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a horse whinnied softly. Caleb's, perhaps, and the sound drifted up to her window like a promise that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Tomorrow, the children would come, wide-eyed and barefoot, carrying more stubbornness than books. Tomorrow, they would hear her voice, and maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't laugh. She smiled into the dark. Tomorrow, she whispered, we begin. The next morning broke quiet and gray, the kind of stillness that made even the birds wait before singing. Clara arrived early, sweeping the steps of the schoolhouse while the chill still clung to the air. Her hands ached from the rough broom handle, but she didn't mind. It felt good to work, to build something of her own. By the time the children began to arrive, her heart was steady again. They came in small clusters, half curious, half shy, clutching slates and pencils tied with string. A few older boys lingered outside, whispering behind their hands. She caught the sound of her name and the muffled giggle that followed. She smiled anyway. Good morning, she said, her voice light and warm. Come in, please. They filed inside, the scrape of boots echoing on the floorboards. Clara waited until the last seat was filled, then stood by the chalkboard. The children stared up at her. Some expectant, some skeptical, all waiting to see what this new teacher from back east would do. Before we begin, she said softly, I'd like you to tell me what you already know. A boy in the front row, Tommy, grinned. I know how to count cattle, ma'am. That's fine work, she said. But I meant in numbers. Laughter rippled through the room. Her cheeks warmed, but she didn't scold. Instead, she drew a single line of chalk across the board and wrote 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Then she turned, her eyes kind but firm. Here, she said, let's count together. Her tone was gentle, measured. The room quieted. Not because she raised her voice, but because something in her calmness pulled the air down to stillness. Even the wind outside seemed to listen. And slowly, the children began to repeat after her. 1, she said. 1, they echoed. +1, +1, equals 2, equals 2. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She felt the fragile seed of trust take root right there, between chalk dust and nervous laughter. By midday, the room was warm from the stove. Clara read aloud from a storybook, her voice lilting through the paragraphs like music. The children leaned forward on their desks, even the rowdy ones who had mocked her earlier. She saw it then, the way words could hold power if spoken with patience, not pride. She had just finished the tale when the door creaked open. Sunlight poured in around the tall figure of Caleb Boone. He stood there awkwardly, hat in hand. Sorry, ma'am, he said. Didn't mean to interrupt. Clara blinked in surprise. Not at all. Come in. The children turned to stare at him. Every one of them knew the rancher who lived out past the pines. Caleb scratched the back of his neck. Brought some lumber for your porch. Thought I'd drop it before the rain. Thank you, she said, then noticed how the children's attention had drifted to him instead of her. Class, what do we say? A chorus of voices chimed. Thank you, Mr. Boone. He gave a small, sheepish nod. You're mighty welcome. Before leaving, his gaze lingered a moment on Clara. Something about the way she stood, unflinching yet soft-spoken, seemed to hold him there. He cleared his throat, then stepped back outside. The children watched through the window as he loaded the last boards off his wagon. One girl whispered, He likes you, Miss Winslow. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. Hush now. Finish your sums. But when she glanced out again, Caleb had already gone, the wagon rolling slowly down the dirt road. And for a reason she couldn't explain, the sight left her chest feeling strangely full. That evening, as she packed up her books, the door opened again. This time it was Mrs. Langford, the baker's wife, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp with gossip. I just thought I'd bring you something, the woman said, setting a basket of biscuits on the desk. Heard you've been teaching the young ones nicely. Thank you, Clara said, smiling. Mrs. Langford tilted her head. You've got a pretty way of talking. Different. Don't let the men around here make fun of it too much. Clara's smile faltered. Do they? Oh, you know how folks are, she said with a shrug. Any woman who sounds too fine makes 'em nervous. She glanced at the blackboard. But I reckon Mr. Boone doesn't mind. He's got sense enough to see worth when it's there. With that, she left, and the door swung shut behind her. The words lingered long after the woman was gone. Later, as twilight fell, Clara walked home along the dirt path toward her rented cabin. Her skirts brushed the wild sage, and crickets hummed in the tall grass. The air smelled faintly of rain. She thought about Caleb Boone, about the quiet strength in his voice, how he never raised it, how he never laughed at hers. He listened. That alone made him different from every man she'd known. At her doorstep, she paused and looked up at the wide dark sky. It was so big, so unjudging. Out here, maybe a woman's voice didn't need to sound a certain way to be heard. Inside, she lit her lamp and opened her journal. Her pen moved slowly, words forming like a prayer. Today they listened. Not all, but some. And one man looked at me as though my voice wasn't strange, but beautiful. She closed the book and smiled softly, unaware that far across the valley, Caleb Boone was sitting by his own fire, remembering the sound of her reading. Clear, patient, unlike anything the prairie had ever known. The days passed like pages turning in a book she didn't want to end. Each morning, the schoolhouse filled with voices that once giggled at her now learning to echo her tone. Steady, clear, and kind. The same children who'd smirked at her fancy speech now waited for her to read aloud each afternoon. It was as though the rhythm of her words had softened the dust itself. Clara had started reading stories from her own worn copy of The Pilgrim's Progress, but she made them her own. She gave each word color and patience, and when she spoke, even the restless boys grew still. It wasn't just the stories. It was how she said them, as if she truly believed each word carried weight. Sometimes, when she looked up from her reading, she saw a figure leaning quietly in the doorway. Caleb Boone. He never interrupted, never stayed long. Just a nod, a trace of a smile, and then he'd leave again, as if checking that her world was still standing. The children noticed too. "Mr. Boone's always around," Tommy said one afternoon, grinning. Clara felt her cheeks warm. "He's a friend to the school," she said briskly, though the warmth didn't leave. Word began to spread through Pine Hollow that the Eastern schoolmarm wasn't so fragile after all. The children were learning quicker than anyone expected. Parents who'd once doubted her started showing up at the schoolhouse door, hats in hand, asking if she might take on extra lessons for their young ones after chores. But not everyone liked the change. At the saloon one evening, Clara's name came up again, this time in the careless talk of men who mistook cruelty for humor. "Fine voice, that one," said one of the ranch hands, his grin mean. "Sounds more like she's reading a prayer than a book." Another snorted. "Reckon she thinks her voice'll charm this town into civility." The laughter rolled like dice on a bar table. Caleb Boone sat in the corner, silent, his whiskey untouched. He'd been content to let talk slide in the past. It wasn't his habit to step into gossip. But something in the way they said her name, how they twisted her grace into mockery, struck a nerve too deep to ignore. He stood, slow and deliberate, and the room hushed. "That woman," he said quietly, "teaches your children to read and think. The least you can do is show respect when you speak her name." The laughter stopped. No one met his eyes. He didn't wait for a reply, just tipped his hat, left a coin on the table, and walked out into the cool dark. Outside, the stars spread wide and silent, like they too were listening. 2 mornings later, Clara was arranging her lesson papers when she noticed the shadow in the doorway again. "Mr. Boone," she said, smiling faintly, "you've become my unofficial guardian." He shrugged, stepping inside. "Can't say this old schoolhouse doesn't need watchin'. Heard some talk in town. Thought maybe I'd walk you home after class." "That's kind of you," she said softly, "but I manage fine." "I don't doubt that," he said. "Still, no harm in company." She hesitated. "Did they say much?" He looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. "They said enough. But I said what needed sayin'." A quiet filled the space between them, thick, unspoken gratitude, the kind that doesn't need to be dressed in words. Finally, she said, "Thank you." Caleb nodded once, the faintest hint of a smile. "You got a good voice, Miss Winslow. World needs more of it, not less." Her heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. "Most people think it is too soft." He met her gaze. Maybe they've forgotten what gentleness sounds like. That evening, they walked together down the dirt path toward her cabin. The air was crisp, the scent of pine rising with each step. Clara found herself speaking more freely than she had with anyone in years. She told him about her father, the expectations she'd fled, the ache of leaving behind everything familiar. Caleb listened, not interrupting once. Only the steady rhythm of his boots on the road told her he was there, every word sinking in like water into dry earth. At last, she said, almost in a whisper, "All my life, I was told my voice was too much, too precise, too polished. I thought maybe out here it would finally sound right." He stopped walking. The fading light caught in his eyes. Steady, kind, unreadable. "It sounds right to me," he said simply. "Always has." She didn't know how to answer. The words caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. So she only smiled, small and grateful, and together they walked the rest of the way in quiet. When they reached her door, she turned to him. "Mr. Boone, you've done more kindness than I deserve." "Maybe," he said, "but not more than you've earned." And with a tilt of his hat, he walked away into the growing dusk. That night, Clara stood at her window long after the lamp went out, the moonlight washing over the hills. She thought of the laughter she'd endured, of the children's bright faces, and of one man's voice, low, sure, unshaken, standing for her when others would not. For the first time in her life, she didn't doubt the worth of her voice, because someone had finally listened. Spring came early to Pine Hollow that year. The frost retreated from the meadows, the creek sang again through the valley, and Clara found herself smiling more easily, laughing without having to think. The schoolhouse windows stood open now, letting in the scent of wildflowers and pine. Her lessons had grown beyond letters and sums. She read to the children from books about faraway places, about courage and kindness and how a voice, no matter how small, could change the course of a day. Sometimes, she caught them mimicking her words, her manner of speech, even her phrasing. The very thing Pine Hollow once mocked was slowly becoming the rhythm of its youngest hearts. Each Friday afternoon, Caleb Boone stopped by, bringing repairs for the schoolhouse or fresh milk from his ranch. It had become their quiet ritual. He rarely stayed long, but every time he arrived, Clara's pulse steadied just a little. His presence had that effect, solid like the land itself. On one of those afternoons, as the last of the children ran down the hill, she looked up from her desk to find Caleb leaning against the doorframe, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "You patch things up quicker than I can fix them," he said, nodding at the new shelf she'd built. She smiled. "Idle hands are wasted hands." "Maybe so," he said softly, "but not every woman knows how to drive a nail straight." "I've learned," she said. "A schoolhouse teaches as much to the teacher as to the children." He stepped further in, brushing a faint line of sawdust from his sleeve. "And what's it been teachin' you lately?" She paused, looking down at the chalk in her hand. "That some lessons take patience. That words don't always reach right away, but they sink in, quietly, if you keep speaking them." Caleb watched her a moment, the faintest trace of admiration softening his features. "Reckon you're good at that," he said. "Speakin' quiet but hittin' deep." Her cheeks warmed. "I used to think my quiet made me weak." He shook his head. "Nah, weak words don't last. Yours do." That evening, they walked together toward town. It had become a habit neither had spoken aloud nor broken. They didn't rush the distance, just walked side by side while the sky turned to gold and the wind tugged at the tall grass. At a small wooden bridge over the creek, Clara stopped, her hands resting on the railing. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. Caleb tilted his head. "Pine Hollow? Yes, this land, it's so open, but sometimes it feels like it keeps people still, like they're afraid to move beyond what they know." He leaned against the railing beside her, considering. "Used to think that," he admitted. "After the war, I swore I'd go somewhere green again. Didn't. Guess I stayed, 'cause I owed this land something." "What could you owe the land?" she asked. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. It took everything I didn't need. Left me only what mattered. She thought about that, about what she'd left behind to come here. About the laughter that once cut like a knife and how now, somehow, it didn't matter. Maybe that's what it does, she said quietly. It takes what doesn't belong, so we can find what does. Caleb smiled faintly. Sounds like something your voice would say. The way he said it made her chest tighten. Her voice, the same one others mocked, he spoke of like it was something worth holding on to. She looked away quickly, the creek glittering below. You think too kindly of me, Mr. Boone. I don't think kindly, he said, shaking his head. Just true. Later that night, alone in her cabin, Clara sat by the small oil lamp and tried to write, but her hand hesitated. Every word she thought to put on paper reminded her of his voice, the gravel warmth of it, the quiet certainty when he spoke her name. She set the pen down and pressed a hand to her heart. You came here to be alone, she reminded herself. To start new, not to feel this again. But she couldn't help it. There was something about him, his restraint, his steadiness, that drew her like music in the silence. He didn't need her to be less than she was. He listened, truly listened, as though her voice filled spaces he'd long left empty. That thought scared her as much as it comforted her. A few days later, Clara found a small bundle left at her schoolhouse door. A carved wooden bird, smooth and simple, wings spread mid-flight. There was no note, but she knew who it was from. She traced its edges with her fingers, feeling the grain of the wood. On the bottom, carved small and neat, were 3 words, "Keep speaking, Clara." Her eyes stung with tears. For so long, her voice had been the thing she tried to hide. Out here, in this quiet stretch of the world, it had become the very thing someone else wanted her to keep. She set the bird on her desk beside her books and whispered, "Then I will." And somewhere across the hills, a rancher looked up from his work and smiled, as if hearing her from afar. The morning light spilled golden over the valley, dust motes floating through the air like quiet promises. Clara stood at the schoolhouse door, brushing the last speck of chalk from her hands. Inside, the laughter of children still lingered, soft as the wind in the wheat. It had been nearly 2 months since the wooden bird appeared, and not a day passed that she didn't glance at it before the first bell. It sat proudly on her desk, wings forever outstretched, a reminder that her voice, her own voice, had a place here. But lately, whispers had begun drifting through town again. Not cruel, not like before, but curious. Folks wondered about the teacher and the cowboy who walked her home at sunset. Some said it was improper. Others said it was inevitable. Caleb never mentioned it. He just showed up, steady as the dawn, whenever her day was done. One afternoon, a storm rolled across Pine Hollow, the sky turning the color of gunmetal. The children scurried home as thunder cracked over the hills. Clara stayed behind, gathering books and closing windows as the wind howled through the trees. She was reaching for the last shutter when the door burst open. Caleb stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes scanning the room until they found her. "You're still here," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "I was just—" she started, but he was already striding toward her. "You shouldn't be alone in this storm," he said, reaching for the latch. "Roads'll wash out fast." She blinked at him, startled by his urgency. "You came all the way from your ranch?" "Reckon I did." His jaw tightened. "Wasn't about to let you walk home in this." Before she could answer, thunder shook the walls, and lightning flashed white across his face. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The rain, the wind, even her breath. Then he said softly, "Let's get you home, Clara." The road was nearly invisible beneath the torrent. He walked beside her, one hand steady at her back, guiding her through the mud and the wind. When a gust nearly tore her shawl away, he caught it, and her, pulling her close. For a moment, they stood chest to chest, rain streaming down their faces, their breaths mingling in the chill air. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, voice trembling. He looked down at her, rain running off his hat brim like silver threads. "And leave you out here alone?" His voice softened. "No, ma'am. That's not in me. Something in his tone, low, raw, unguarded, made her heart ache. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. Instead, she just nodded and walked on, her hand brushing his as they made their way through the storm. When they reached her cabin, she hurried to light the lamp, her hands shaking from the cold. Caleb stood near the door, water dripping onto the floorboards, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. "You're drenched," she said. "You'll catch your death. Wait here." She fetched a blanket and offered it to him, but he only shook his head. "Keep it," he murmured. "You're colder than I am." Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened. The rain battered the roof, wind howling like a chorus of ghosts outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "You didn't have to come for me." Caleb's eyes softened. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding like hooves on dry ground. "And why is that?" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "Because every time I hear your voice, Clara, it feels like the world quiets down long enough to breathe again." Her lips parted, but no sound came. He lifted a hand slowly, as if afraid she'd vanish. His fingers brushed a loose strand of her hair, tucking it gently behind her ear. The touch sent a shiver through her, half fear, half longing. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the silence turned electric. He looked at her one last time, then stepped back, voice low. "I'll see you tomorrow." And before she could ask him to stay, before she could even speak, he was gone into the night. Clara stood there long after the door closed, her hand still tingling where his fingers had brushed her. She pressed it against her heart, whispering to herself, "You can't hide from something that kind." The storm faded to a whisper, but she barely noticed, because for the first time in her life, the silence around her didn't feel lonely. It felt alive. The storm passed, leaving behind a land washed clean. The next morning, the valley shimmered beneath a veil of mist, and the scent of wet sagebrush filled the air. Clara stood outside the schoolhouse steps, watching sunlight break through the clouds, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. Something inside her had shifted, not loud, not sudden, but deep, like the turning of a river's course. She'd spent years fearing her own voice, afraid of what it revealed, what it might stir in others. But now, each word she spoke to her students seemed steadier, warmer. The children noticed it first. They looked at her not with curiosity, but trust. And slowly the town began to notice too. At the general store, old Mrs. Cartwright, who used to purse her lips whenever Clara passed, offered a polite nod. At church, one of the ranch wives complimented her reading of the hymn. "You've got a real gift for it," she'd said. "Brings peace to a person." Clara smiled softly, unsure how to answer. She'd never been anyone's source of peace before. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of Caleb's words. "Every time I hear your voice, the world quiets down long enough to breathe again." Those words haunted her in the best way. When she passed him in town, he tipped his hat, eyes holding hers just long enough to make her heart skip. He didn't speak much, didn't have to. A glance from him felt like a conversation, a promise unspoken. One late afternoon, as the sun lowered toward the ridge, Clara was closing up the schoolhouse when she heard the familiar sound of boots on the porch. "Thought you might need a hand," Caleb said from the doorway. She turned, a smile already tugging at her lips. "You seem to think I'm in constant need of saving. Maybe I just like being nearby when you're done for the day." Her pulse quickened. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. He tilted his head, the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Why not? They're true." He helped her gather supplies, the air between them filled with quiet warmth. When he handed her the last stack of papers, his fingers brushed hers, just barely, but enough to send a jolt through her chest. Caleb's eyes lingered on her face for a long moment. "You've been busy," he said softly. "I hear the children sing in your songs all over town." Clara looked down, cheeks coloring. "They're not my songs. Just ones I remember from back east." He shook his head. "Maybe, but they sound different when you teach 'em." Kinder, somehow. Her gaze lifted to his. You think so? I know so, he said. You've got a way of making this place softer. Lord knows it's needed that for a long time. She smiled faintly, though her heart was thundering. And what about you, Caleb? Do you think you've gone soft, too? He looked out across the field, jaw flexing. Maybe a little, he admitted. If that's what happens when a man listens long enough to something good, I reckon I don't mind. The silence that followed was alive with unsaid things. The sound of the wind through the grass filled the space between them like a whispered hymn. That evening, as they walked toward her cabin, they passed a small group gathered by the fence line. Mrs. Cartwright, the blacksmith, and 2 ranch hands. They paused their conversation as Clara and Caleb approached. For the first time, there was no laughter, no ridicule. Only watchful eyes and a quiet sort of respect. Caleb gave them a curt nod, his hand hovering near Clara's back but not quite touching. The gesture was protective, unspoken, but everyone saw it. "Evenin', Miss Clara," Mrs. Cartwright called, voice softer than it had ever been. "The children have been talkin' about your lessons all week." Clara blinked, surprised. "Oh? I do hope it's for a good reason." The old woman chuckled. "For the best kind. They say you make readin' sound like music." Clara didn't know what to say. Her heart swelled so suddenly she had to take a slow breath before answering. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." As they walked on, Caleb smiled slightly. "Told you they'd come around. You think that's what this is?" she asked quietly. "Them coming around?" He nodded toward the horizon. "People don't stay hard forever. Not when they're shown something worth softening for." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what about you, Caleb Holt? What made you soften?" He stopped walking, eyes fixed on her with quiet intensity. "You did." The world seemed to narrow until there was only him, his voice, his nearness, the heat between them like a living thing. Clara felt her breath catch. She wanted to speak, to say something to match the weight of what he'd given her. But no words would come. He reached out, brushing his thumb against her sleeve. "Don't worry," he murmured. "You don't have to say a thing. I already heard it." That night, long after he'd gone, Clara sat by the fire, staring at the flames' slow dance. For the first time, she wasn't haunted by silence. She was comforted by it, because now she knew her voice wasn't meant to fill every space. Sometimes, the right heart heard it even when she didn't speak at all. By early autumn, the air in Pine Hollow grew sharp with the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. The hills turned amber and gold, and the wind carried the faintest whisper of winter's coming. Clara felt the season turning not only in the land but in herself. The children's laughter had grown freer. The men in town nodded when she passed, their old mockery replaced by something else, a kind of respect she still wasn't used to. Her lessons were fuller, her evenings quieter, and yet there was a growing ache beneath the calm. Because though Caleb still walked her home when he could, lately he'd been distant, distracted, as if a thought was weighing on him heavier than words could carry. She saw it the moment he rode up one evening, dust clinging to his boots and the brim of his hat tilted low. "You've been away," she said softly as he dismounted. "Had to take some cattle north," he answered. His tone was even, but something flickered behind his eyes, something unsaid. 3 days, she murmured. It felt longer. He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat, the guarded lines of his face softened. "Felt longer to me, too." The words hung between them, unclaimed, fragile. They walked along the fence line as the sun melted into the horizon, its light brushing the tall grass with copper. "Things are changin' fast in town," Caleb said after a while. "Folks talkin' different, actin' different." Clara smiled faintly. "They found kinder things to say?" He nodded. "Some have, but not everyone." She stopped walking, looking up at him. "You mean the whispers?" He hesitated, then sighed. "You know how people can be. Don't take kindly to what they don't understand." "You mean, you and me," she said quietly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "They think a man like me oughta keep his distance from a lady with your grace." They don't see that maybe it's the other way around. Maybe I'm the one reaching up. Her heart clenched. You shouldn't say that. Why not? It's true. His voice was low, rough. You've made this town better just by being in it. Made me better. A gust of wind swept through the field, tugging at her hair. She turned away slightly, blinking against the sting of it. But really, it wasn't the wind that made her eyes blur. I came here to start over, she said softly. Not to be noticed. Not to be anything. Caleb took a slow step toward her. And yet, somehow, you became everything this place needed. She looked up, startled. He smiled faintly. Don't you see it, Clara? Folks ain't Logan anymore. They're listening. That's what you do. You make people listen to the good again. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. He went on, quieter now. You did it for me, too. Before you came along, this land was just work and silence. Now I catch myself hearing things I'd forgotten. Wind through the grass, horses breathing, my own damn heart beating. The world seemed to hold its breath. Caleb reached up, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered just a second too long. Clara, he said, voice almost a whisper. You ever think maybe the good Lord sent you here so someone like me could learn to hear again? Her throat tightened. And what about me? What if he sent you so I'd remember how to speak? Their eyes locked, two souls caught between restraint and longing. For a heartbeat, he almost closed the space between them. His hand hovered near her face, the warmth of it tangible even in the cool air. Then slowly he let it fall. You should get inside, he murmured. It'll be dark soon. She nodded, though her heart screamed for him to stay. As he turned to leave, she called softly, Caleb. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Whatever they say in town, she whispered, don't let it change how you see me. He gave a faint, rueful smile. Ain't a thing in this world that could. And then he was gone, the sound of his horse fading into the distance until only the wind remained, carrying his name through the tall, whispering grass. That night, Clara sat by the window, her fingers tracing idle circles on the fogged glass. The storm lantern cast soft light across her face. She could still feel his nearness, the weight of what he hadn't said. Outside, the wind shifted, the kind that always comes before a season breaks. And she knew it then. Whatever awaited her and Caleb, it would not be decided by the whispers of a small town. It would be decided by the courage to speak and to listen when it mattered most. The days grew shorter, and with each morning, Clara felt the subtle tug of change in the air. The crisp scent of frost lingered in the valleys, and the sun dipped sooner behind the distant ridge. Pine Hollow had begun to hum with life differently now. The laughter of children carried farther, voices softened, respect replacing mockery in every glance. And yet, for all the peace the town had begun to show, the space between Clara and Caleb Boone seemed heavier than ever. It began with small moments. A hand brushes hers as they carry firewood to her cabin. A pause at the schoolhouse door, where their eyes held longer than propriety allowed. Words hovered on the tip of their tongues, too fragile, too dangerous to speak aloud. Clara knew the feeling, the pull of longing wrapped in restraint. She had spent so long running from the past, fearing the vulnerability that came with voice and presence alike. And now Caleb Boone, patient, steadfast, impossibly kind, made her want to stop running. One evening, as twilight painted the hills in bruised shades of lavender, Caleb arrived at her door with a parcel of fresh-baked bread from Mrs. Langford. Rain had dusted the roads, leaving a sheen over the earth that made boots slip with every step. "Evenin', Miss Winslow," he said, tipping his hat. "Brought something from the bakery. Thought you might be hungry after teachin' all day." Clara smiled faintly, taking the basket. "Thank you. You didn't have to come all this way." He shrugged, hands resting on the brim of his hat. "I reckon I did. Someone's got to make sure the schoolmarm doesn't starve herself." The warmth in his tone betrayed something unspoken. She opened the cabin door, and they stepped inside, the fire casting golden light across the walls. For a long moment, they simply stood, neither moving toward the other, yet the air seemed charged, as if the very room held its breath. Clara began, but stopped, unsure how to voice what sat heavy in her chest. You don't have to say it, Caleb murmured, stepping closer. The faint scent of rain clung to him, and for a heartbeat she felt the pull of something dangerous and sweet, the kind that could undo a woman who had learned to protect her heart. Her gaze dropped. It's just difficult, being here, feeling things I've never felt before, trusting you. He reached out slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The touch was tentative, reverent. I know, he said quietly, and I'd never ask you to trust me more than you're ready to. Clara's breath caught. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them molten and steady at once. But what about you, Caleb? She asked, voice trembling. Don't you feel? He closed the distance then, carefully, just a hair away from her lips. His voice lowered to a whisper. Every damn day. You have no idea. The moment stretched. Time slowed. She felt the warmth of him, the weight of what could be said, the danger in speaking it aloud. And yet, still, neither moved the final inch. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the cabin shutters, carrying the smell of the pine and the rain-soaked earth. It was as if the prairie itself demanded restraint, as if it understood the peril of unspoken words. Finally, Caleb stepped back, eyes never leaving hers. I don't want to rush this. Don't want to scare you, Clara. Her lips parted, words hanging, fragile. I don't want to be scared either. He nodded, a faint, knowing smile tugging at his lips. Then we'll take it slow, one day at a time. The fire crackled between them, and in the silence, they heard the truth that had never been spoken aloud. They were already bound, not by vows or declarations, but by trust, by care, and by a quiet understanding that no one in Pine Hollow, not even the whispers of the town, could alter. That night, Clara stood at her window, looking out over the hills. The shadows stretched long across the valley, the creek glinting silver under the moon. Her hand rested on the wooden bird Caleb had left months ago, wings forever outstretched, a symbol of hope, courage, and the power of a voice held steady. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heart beat fiercely against the quiet. Caleb's presence lingered in her mind, in the warmth of the fire, in the wind that whispered through the cabin walls. And she realized that some things, some words, did not need to be spoken aloud to be heard. Sometimes the heart understood what the voice dared not admit. The first frost had kissed the valley, turning the hills into a quilt of silvery white. The creek gleamed like molten glass beneath the rising sun, and the pine trees shimmered with icy crystals that rattled softly in the morning wind. Pine Hollow had grown quieter in some ways, but Clara could feel the life in it. Children running, neighbors exchanging nods, the subtle warmth of a town that had learned to see differently. She stepped outside the schoolhouse, arms full of lesson papers and books. The children were already gathering, laughter ringing clear as a bell, voices strong and steady. It was the kind of morning that promised change. And change had come. Caleb Boone appeared at the gate, boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt. The brim of his hat was dusted with hoarfrost, but his eyes were steady, warm, and entirely focused on her. "Morning, Miss Winslow," he said, voice quiet but sure. "Morning, Mr. Boone," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. He nodded at the children playing in the yard. "Seems you've taught 'em more than just their letters." "They've taught me plenty," Clara said softly, adjusting her shawl. "About patience, about hope." He took a step closer, the wind tugging at his coat. "And you've taught me something too." Her pulse quickened. "And what might that be?" "That a person's voice can change a town," he said. "But it can also change a man." The children waved, calling out for attention, but Clara barely noticed. All her focus was on Caleb, the way his gaze held hers, unwavering and honest. "I've been afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid that my voice wouldn't matter, that I'd be invisible." "You ain't invisible," he said, taking another step closer. until the space between them was small and full of meaning. Not to me, not to the children, not to this town, and I reckon, not to yourself either. She looked down, unsure how to meet the depth in his eyes. Her heart thumped like a wild stallion. And you? What about you, Caleb? Have you been invisible? He shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him. Never. Not when I'm hearin' someone like you. The wind shifted, scattering frost and leaves around them. He reached out slowly, brushing his fingers against her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let him take it, letting warmth flow between them, binding them quietly yet irrevocably. Clara, he said, voice low, intimate. I don't want to hide what I feel. I've tried to be patient, tried to wait, but I can't. Not anymore. You've got my heart, whether you'll take it or not. Her breath caught. The words she had kept buried in her chest, the longing she had feared admitting, rose to meet his. I feel it too, she whispered. Every day, since the moment I first heard your voice in the schoolyard, I felt it. Caleb's hand lifted to cup her cheek gently, thumb brushing away a trace of frost or perhaps a stray tear. Then it's ours, he said softly. No more hiding, no more waiting. If you'll let me, Clara, I'll walk beside you, through every storm, every quiet morning, and every sunset. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were tears of relief, joy, and love. She nodded slowly, letting her own hand find his. Yes, I'll walk with you. The children, noticing the stillness between them, whispered and giggled softly, though none interrupted. It was as if even the smallest hearts understood the importance of this moment. Caleb smiled, pulling her gently close. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling, hearts beating in quiet rhythm. And in that simple, unhurried gesture, Clara realized the truth she had long avoided. Love need not shout to be heard. Sometimes, it was the quiet, patient voice, steady and unwavering, that bound hearts forever. By mid-morning, news had spread through Pine Hollow. Neighbors and townsfolk began stopping by, offering nods, smiles, and quiet congratulations. No mockery, no teasing, just recognition. Clara felt the town embracing her for the woman she had become. Brave, strong, gentle, and entirely unafraid to speak her mind when it mattered. And Caleb stood beside her, a steady presence, her partner not just in affection, but in the quiet reshaping of the world around them. She looked up at him as they walked together back to the schoolhouse, hand in hand. The wind carried their laughter, soft and full, over the valley, rustling the pine and tall grass like a song only they could hear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and painted the valley in gold and violet, Clara set the wooden bird Caleb had left months ago on the windowsill. Its wings were forever outstretched, a symbol of courage, of voice, and of love that had waited patiently for recognition. She felt Caleb's arm brush hers and turned to meet his eyes. No words were needed. Their hearts spoke louder than any voice ever could. And for the first time in her life, Clara knew she had found a place where she belonged. Not just in a town or a schoolhouse or a quiet cabin in the hills. She belonged in the heart of someone who truly heard her, Caleb Boone, and in the quiet strength of her own voice. The wind whispered across the valley, carrying their unspoken vows, their laughter, and the promise of every sunrise they would greet together. Somewhere beyond the hills, the prairie listened, and it approved.